unidentified flying object.
I'm Jack Oswald, and you're listening.
This is Hudson Hammond, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Okay, welcome back to another great episode of Dr. J Radio Live. I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Angels, or City of Demons, depending on who you ask. And we are internationally syndicated, starting with late night in the Midlands in the United States with the terrestrial affiliates, and Deprogram Radio Network in the United Kingdom, as well as their terrestrial affiliates. Now, today, we bring you someone that I've been wanting to talk to for quite some time, someone who actually did his job and actually is being talked about because of that, for that reason. He spent 30 years in the U.S. government intelligence, and I'm going to let him tell you more about it. So without further ado, let me introduce our guest, the one and only Mr. William, who's going to go by Bill Binney, former NSA employee. Mr. Binney, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
So
it's good to be with you.
It's always a pleasure, and it's really a pleasure to speak to you because I've been seeking you out for quite some time. Now, let me ask you this. I read here you started, or you left in 2001, and you were an employee for 30 years. So what made you want to join in 1971?
Actually, it was June of 1970 when I went into April of 70 when I joined the NSA as a civilian. But I was working for NSA under the military and Army Security Agency, which is the NSA is really two parts. It's the NSA CSS. The CSS is the Combined Security Services. That's the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine components of SIGINT. So that's why the director of NSA is a military guy, because he has under him those components of the military. But I was in there for 4 years prior to that, from 1965 to 69. So that's how I got into NSA. And from there, I did a few things that they kind of liked, so they wanted me to come back as a civilian. So that's what I did. I joined them that way.
Why the NSA versus the CIA? And for those people, obviously everyone living in America and even in the UK or anywhere around the world knows NSA, National Security Agency. And Bill, I'm sure you had also heard this term, no such agency. It's obviously been shown in popular films. But why the NSA versus CIA or DIA or something else like that?
Well, the NSA is more technical, and I was a mathematician by training, so I was more technical. So the Army put me in that direction. Otherwise, I could have ended up with DIA and maybe eventually with CIA. But so for the technical side of me, my training and all, they thought I should belong in the SIGINT section, which is the technical side of it. CIA is more human,
What exactly did you start doing after you started in June 1970 through the 70s, and what notices did you see or changes did you notice from the 70s that progressed throughout your entire career that made it to where it was something that you to this day see things wrong with it? I mean, for instance, Edward Snowden, who was just a contractor, not directly working for the NSA, but a contractor, obviously went ahead and left the country, the United States, and to this day is still wanted via espionage because of what he talked about for spying on the United States citizens. But when did you start noticing any changes in the NSA that was not what you signed up for?
Actually, I think it really started in the mid to late 70s, 1970s, because there was a tendency for, once internally in NSA, they reorganized in the late 60s. They separated technology, that is computer science and engineering and system development, from operations, which is where we had the need to be satisfied by the technology people. When you separated them, they created a little space and a barrier for communicating back and forth and actually working together, and it created two separate sets of requirements or agendas. one on the operations side, we still had the concept of solving the mission. That is, doing the job of doing predictions of intentions and capabilities by potential adversaries, so you could actually intervene and stop terrorist attacks and things like that. And the other was the systems or the technology people, and their emphasis was more like building things, so they needed contracts and money, and so that set their agenda separate from the mission. So you had those two agendas running, and when that started, and that over time that just got more and more profound and more separated and more barriers, so that fundamentally what happened was the technology people, which were getting all the money, were focusing more on contracts and actually keeping the contracts going rather than solving the mission. So that's why you have the problem of collecting all kinds of data, but not actually solving the mission, because they don't have they haven't focused on actually doing that. They focused on building empires and getting contracts and money. And so that's the reason it's only gotten worse since then.
It sounds like they were wasting millions of dollars. It's actually something that you reported in September 2002 to the U.S. The U.S. Defense Department Inspector General, and you noticed this back 20 some years before you even left the NSA.
Yeah, originally I thought that as a vision statement went, the technology people and the contractors' vision was aim low and miss, because they failed at every time they tried to do something. It was like it was a perpetual failure, And so, but eventually it became very clear that that wasn't their objective at all. It was to keep the problem going so the money keeps flowing. That's the whole concept. Get the next contract and keep the contracts going. I mean, because once you build yourself a big empire, a big organization, you have to sustain it. And when you go for contracts, most of the money then goes into sustaining your bulk as an organization. That's still what's true today, and it's gotten even worse now because there's so many more contractors surrounding these agencies that are being basically funded by and wasting taxpayer money. I mean, you could think that up almost 70% of the budget could be cut, and they wouldn't lose any capability if they focused back on solving the mission and not just building an empire.
Now, what is their actual mission, that their statement mission when you first joined, that was told to you?
Yeah, that was the charter. The charter for NSA was to do foreign intelligence. It is intelligence against foreign threats. And so what that meant very simply was we were to collect data and information on foreigners and figure out the threats from potential adversaries around the world. That was our charter, and that still is the charter. I was on WABC radio once with General Hayden, and he said all this stuff was legal, and I thought, well, if you're talking about the FISA court, that's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, what part of foreign is domestic? When he switched and changed the collection of NSA to domestic collection and took in everything on every possible U.S. citizen he could, why, that was domestic spying on a grand scale. And so that's why what I objected to, and that's basically why I left, or as soon as I could.
I'm glad you brought up the FISA. Most people don't even know what that means, and I have to explain the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. You just said the key word, foreign, right?
That's right.
How does that imply spying on the United States citizens? And then the problem with a FISA court is that you have a government, usually FBI or maybe another attorney working for the government, going to a FISA court. That is classified. The actual court is classified. And there has not been a single case where the FISA judge did not say okay to the warrant or give the warrant to whoever was seeking it. And also the defense, whoever the defendant is, does not know about it. It's very one-sided, and once it applies that way, it circumvents the entire Constitution. You were probably recognizing this back when you were still dealing with the KGB, Stasi, and things like that, weren't you?
Yes, actually, I think the FISA court meets on the 6th floor of the Department of Justice building in Washington, and they hear only the government side of the argument. They don't hear anything else. And by the way, they have no way of validating or verifying anything the government's telling them. They have to take it at face value. They have no way of about ensuring that it's true. And the fact that these agencies, mostly these FBI, CIA, and NSA, those are the three main ones who come in with requests for these kind of warrants with the FISA court using classified material. So basically, when they do that, there is no other component in there arguing for the other side or arguing the point about constitutionality of what they're doing. For example, the first Edward Snowden, when the first release from Edward Snowden's material was the FISA warrant to Verizon to turn over all of the data on their customers, which is something like 110 plus million U.S. citizens. Well, that meant, if you looked at the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, in any warrant, they're supposed to state the probable cause for each and every person in the warrant, and also what they're going after for that reason, from that person, and where they're going to get it. Now, none of that was stated in that warrant. It was just a general warrant. And back in the Revolution, we called those general writs, and that's why one of the main reasons we had a revolution. And these judges seem to have forgotten the Constitution. At least they aren't applying it here. They should know better. You would think that a judge that's reached that level of being able to be appointed by the chair of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice, they should at least know the Constitution. These people obviously have forgotten it, and they need to be fired. In fact, that court needs to be disbanded. Everything needs to come out in the open, where in the open Article 3 courts, where you can have the proper argument, pro and con on any issue.
Now, in the 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the reemergence of Germany combining as a whole after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and so we no longer had the KGB, but this is prior to the FSB, after the Stasi, who were we primarily looking at? Because I do know from our history that in the 80s that we were worrying about the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, but that was the 80s. What would you say was in the 90s the biggest problem for the NSA in the United States?
Well, internally they had to look around to find out who would be the next target. How could we justify the size of the NSA at the time? And the whole point was to look at the internet, which was exploding in terms of digital communications, phones and emails, things of that nature. So that was the new target. And in there, we looked to find out who could be the targets. Well, a lot of communications for governments and militaries still went over that, as well as terrorists and international crime. So that became the new issue. The focus on the digital age and the digital communications and international crime was primarily the main focus at that time.
Recently, we were just talking about smartphones, and these days they don't have to physically wiretap because everyone in their pocket has something that has GPS and has cameras on both sides of it. And back in 2007, I believe it was David Petraeus, when he was director of CIA, said publicly that we now have, the United States, have the capability of turning on your camera without you even knowing. Now, this was on your laptop because this was the first year that we had the iPhone, which was the precursor to all the other smartphones. Did you know about this long before it was released publicly? Because I would think this would have been classified at that level long before they told the public about it.
Yes, and all of that is basically classified in terms of active attack. That is going at actively attacking your device to get information. The British, when they were discussing the Investigative Powers Bill a couple of years ago, I went to testify to the House of Lords, and they were openly discussing what they were doing, and that was GCHQ and MI6 and MI5 involved in all this stuff over there. Over here, it's CIA, FBI, and NSA. But they were openly discussing bulk attack on devices, and not just bulk collection, but bulk attack on device. That means actually penetrating into the device to actually taking material off that device, whatever it is, a phone, a computer, and it's not just video. It's also listening to you and actually draining your computer of the data you have on it.
And it's being stored in all these massive areas. And these days, because of Moore's law, which I read is coming to an end every 18 months, the amount of transistors that you're able to put on a circuit double. And so I would think that the amount that they're able to confine in one little area has greatly expanded. Now, there are NSA bases off the US or outside the US. Can you name where they are?
Well, there's any number of them. They're actually on the web. If you go look and look for Echelon sites, you'll find a bunch of them in Canada, Australia, UK, at Menwith Hill, and various other places around the world, plus cooperating countries, not just the Five Eyes, the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, but also about 9 other countries that are participating in the bulk acquisition of data. And they're listed in that Echelon program, too, on the web. If you go and look at it, you can get the locations of basically all of them. So it's actually it's all public knowledge right now.
Now, going back to the time that you were actually working for the NSA, you were one of the inventors of a system called Thin Thread, which was sort of shelved in place of Trailblazer, which was using more money. Can you talk about those two programs and why they chose one over the other than just like what we said earlier, to maintain their empire by continuing to feed the money? Like you said, 70% of the budget could still be cut and their mission could still be solved, but yet, of course, that's not the way it works, sadly, and hopefully it changes.
Yeah. Well, it basically boiled down to this. The Thin Thread program we were designing back in the 90s, because even back then, with the kind of the minor collection amount that we were doing back then relative to what's happening today, even at that time, the amount of data coming in was burying our analysts, and they couldn't see the threats involved in the data, by any of the targets that were communicating in the data they were looking at. There was just too much data to see it. So the whole idea of the Thin Thread program was to focus in on what was relevant and pull out only that and let everything else go by. And so that's what we did. Fundamentally, you're looking at, the idea is pretty simple. You're going to pull out the needles from the haystack and let the haystack flow right on by and not take it in. That gave privacy to everybody, not just in the United States, but also in the world. So, it also meant that we had solved the problem of volume, velocity, and variety of communications in the digital age. That was something they didn't want Congress or anybody else to know, because then that takes away the problem, so you don't have the problem to ask for money. So they wanted to keep complaining about the problem, keep the money flowing, and so they had to get rid of the Thin Thread program. But one of the things they did, we had 3 things they removed from that program. And they used it. The Trailblazer program actually produced nothing, really. Except for PowerPoint pictures. That was nice for about $8 or $10 billion. But the first thing that we had to do to be able to pull the needles out of the haystack was to be able to see what was in the haystack. So that meant you could actually understand what was there. And so you could decide whether or not you wanted to take it. That was the first thing they removed, because they wanted everything. So that meant instead of filtering only needles out, they would just take in everything. And the second thing was that they removed was we had in the Thin Thread program a set of code that would encrypt the attributes of any person that was in there that wasn't known to be a bad guy of one form or another. In other words, we'd have a warrant on them. And so we would encrypt their identity so nobody could tell, even inside NSA, who they were until you could prove probable cause and get a warrant. Then we would expose them. And then the final thing they had that we were developing that they removed was an auditing program to see who came into our network, what they did, how long they stayed, where they went, all the things they tried to do with the data, or removing data or manipulating data. So we could tell all of that just from the network log activity and auditing that as it was ongoing. So what it meant was if they'd have kept that program and implemented it across the entire NSA network, if Edward Snowden would have come up and tried to download material, as he started to download, we would know it within tens of milliseconds.
It sounds to me that one of the reasons they wanted to remove that third part, the auditing, was, like you said, so they can just continue to spend more and more money. And I would think that when they have to go ask for more money from the Congress or the House of Representatives or the Senate, it's classified. They don't tell them everything unless they're on that committee. Am I right?
It's carried under a secret budget. Yeah. There's an open budget and there's a secret component of that budget, and it's all that stuff is under the secret part of the budget.
Some people call that secret budget the black projects. Would you also categorize that as the similar term?
That's a subset of the secret budget.
Interesting, very interesting. Now,
this is the one where they don't even want Congress or any number of limited numbers of people anywhere in government to know what was happening. And in fact, when they turn over the money to either the CIA or NSA, they're never told what happens to it. They don't have really an audit. There's no auditing of NSA or CIA and their use of money anyway.
One thing, let me ask you, if you could just make a guesstimate or an estimation of what you know back when you were working for the NSA, what was the secret budget as opposed to what the normal budget would have been? Just to say the last year you worked there, say 2000 to 2001, that fiscal year.
Well, I think the budget back then was a little less than $5 billion a year.
Wow.
For the NSA budget. Now that's basically doubled, or I think it's probably tripled since then. And CIA similarly has grown, and so has FBI and other intelligence agencies. So I think my estimate was, certainly in the last 17 years they spent over $1 trillion on intelligence.
And a lot of it, what has it gotten us? Literally, what has it gotten us? What are the results, as you mentioned? It seems to me like just like what you were saying earlier, they want the problem to continue so they could keep getting more money out of it. Again, going back to the original building of the empire. Now, you mentioned Edward Snowden, and you mentioned that had they used your program, then he would have been caught. But he didn't get caught. Do you think what he revealed, especially with Verizon spying on so many people, and for those people out there, I guess I might as well admit that I'm a Verizon customer and was back then, which means all of my information was also taken there. But what do you think of the fact that he decided it was morally wrong and he wanted to talk about it, and he did? Do you think that that was in violation of what he was supposed to do, or what we said before we started this interview, that this actually fell within the purviews of what's supposed to happen?
Yes, in fact, if you go and read Executive Order 13526, Section 1.7, that's the executive order that governs classification of data by the U.S. government, and it's signed by every president that comes into office. And it says in that section, you cannot classify, maintain classified, or not declassify data that's evidence of a crime, corruption, fraud, waste, abuse, or embarrassment to individuals or agencies. So that simply means that all this spying, domestic spying, is a crime and a violation of the constitutional rights of U.S. citizens, and cannot and must be declassified. Because it falls under that category. So, in essence, that's something that should have been taken care of by our government and all the members of our government who have taken an oath of office to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Right now, we have a lot of domestic enemies of our Constitution.
And that's actually the saddest part, and this goes back to what we were saying earlier, that the FISA court, they're using the FISA court, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, to spy on United States citizens. What is their justification for that? I mean, at least what did they tell you?
They didn't tell me anything because they knew I wouldn't accept it as truth, and they didn't want me testifying in court. And I've got two affidavits sworn in the federal court system supporting lawsuits against the U.S. government for violations of the constitutional rights of U.S. citizens. One in the Third Circuit and one in the Ninth Circuit with the EFF lawsuit, Jewel versus NSA. The other lawsuit is in the Third Circuit. And in that lawsuit, I've included exhibits from NSA, from Edward Snowden's release of material, the relevant parts that I thought should be highlighted in terms of domestic spying. And in that affidavit in federal court, I have sworn to be able to testify to all of that, which I can do, and I'm waiting for them to call me to do exactly that. So far, the government is trying to keep us out of court. They want to get it dismissed so it's not discussed in in Article 3 courts, the open court. They don't want it discussed out there because then they would have to deal with the crimes they've been committing in public, and they don't want to do that.
Because the people who would be doing the arresting would end up being arrested if that was the case, because again, like you said, all foreign and domestic criminals or terrorists, that's the biggest thing. Now, is it safe to say that every United States citizen, along with other countries, especially with the other echelon bases that we talked about, are being spied upon? So, for instance, in the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, is it safe to assume that pretty much every smartphone, everybody's landline, or specifically a laptop, because I heard it's easier to tap into something wirelessly as opposed to something wired. So would you agree with that assessment that every single person is under surveillance, including this right now?
Oh, yes, of course. And it's done by various tapping points on the fiber optic network primarily. Because, if you go wireless, your wireless only goes so far, and then it has to go into the landlines or the fibers. And for example, if you have a cell phone and you're calling somebody like we are now from the United States to Europe, right? It goes to fiber, it goes to the wireless cell phone towers, and then into the fiber optic networks, transoceanic, and then up onto the fiber network over in Europe, and then into the towers, the cell phone towers here in Europe. So it goes through various numbers of systems, but mostly the transiting is carried primarily on the fiber network. So they tap the fiber network and take everything off the fiber network using devices like a NARIS device or a Verint device. These are devices that sessionize the fiber optic lines at the rates of, the NARIS Insight device was the latest one I knew about, which did a 10 gigabit line. It is everything on 10 gigabits of fiber. That's like 64 fibers. You've seen those big pipes with all those fibers coming out of them?
Yes.
Pictures in magazines and so on. Well, those are like 64 fibers. That's a 10 gigabit line. It takes everything off that line and captures it all.
That's actually, sad. At the same time, we knew it, but the more you know in detail, the more, I guess, scared you could be. Unless, at the same time, though, people say, well, we sacrifice our privacy because our society has moved to a way to accept more technology. So therefore, if you have nothing to hide, why should you have your privacy? But privacy is something that's supposed to be inherent anyway. Do you see that there's a balance of why safety over privacy the privacy should be overcome in case or due to the fact that they want to so-called protect us, protect the citizens?
Well, you see that the requirement you're saying the requirement to give up privacy if you want security. Well, that's been a lie from the beginning. That was the whole point. That was the first swindle that I saw coming. That's primarily one of the reasons I left also. And one of the reasons we were complaining to the DODIG's office about the over-collection of data, simply because, again, the thin thread program successfully pulled out the needles from the haystack. And that meant that you were acquiring all the data necessary to manage and monitor the targets you were interested in, the terrorists and criminals and governments and so on. So that, all the things that were required reporting for all of the customers in Washington, all the departments and so on, were being met by pulling out the needles and letting the haystack go by. But see, the point was they wanted everything. In order to justify it, they gave you this big lie that said you have to give up privacy for security. Otherwise, we won't have the data to find the bad guys. Well, that's been a lie from the beginning, and we proved that with the thin thread program. So, and it eventually ended up with giving them information on everybody, and that's what they're doing today. Well, that's power over everyone, power over people in different parliaments around the world, power on our own government, for God's sake. I mean, they're spying on our own people. I mean, take Brennan, for example. He ordered his people to spy on the on the Senate Intelligence Committee when they were investigating the torture program at the CIA. So, and that's not the only one. I mean, we have other NSA whistleblowers that say NSA, and the intelligence community been doing that all along. But it's not just for members of Congress. It's also for members of the Supreme Court, members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the White House, everything. It's everything in the fiber network and any communications that inside the United States, that's what they're looking at.
Throughout your term, you've seen many different presidents in the Oval Office. Have you seen changes throughout, whether it be Republican versus Democrat, or did it just get worse by the year or per term?
I think it just gets worse because, and it doesn't matter, whether it's Republican or Democrat in the office, in the House, Senate, or the White House. It doesn't seem to matter. When capabilities are improved, they leverage them and take advantage of them to gain more knowledge over everybody. I guess the point is they're afraid of the public themselves. And so when Reagan, when he said back when he was in office, he said, we're a country with a government. I said, now we are a government with a country.
Very interesting. He actually didn't even see it, and I'm sure even in his later life, after he served his 8 years, he probably still didn't see it. That's one thing that worries me about where we are today. Now, you were shown in Steve Bannon's film Trump at War. What caused you to go into or to be filmed for that documentary? Because it was very telling, and for those people who haven't seen it, I saw it on One American News Network. It could be available, I would think, other places. When they asked you to participate in it, what was their, I don't want to say agenda, that's the wrong word. What was their ask?
I can't remember. They may have taken clips from my various things that I've been testifying to and put it together. I'm not sure exactly what that was, but my point is I always accept anybody's opportunity to get the word out on what's really happening. And so otherwise the mainstream media doesn't ask me to come on that much at all. So,
I agree with you.
Because they don't want to hear it.
That's exactly why we're doing independent media, because the mainstream media is definitely censored. As a matter of fact, Larry King just came out and talked about the mainstream media, said his old bosses at CNN, everything has changed in the last 25 years. He said that when Trump started running for office, at the beginning, when there was 17 Republican candidates, they started covering him and bashing him first, and the same thing with MSNBC and things like that. So that's why we've always taken a big, I don't want to say anything major or anything that would violate the FCC, but we don't work with the mainstream media because we are truth seekers. So that's why we actually are very grateful to speak to you. Now, for those young people who are just wanting to join some sort of intelligence agency right now, whose idea is we're going to protect the United States, we're going to get rid of these terrorists, there's not going to be any more threats, what would you say to them?
I've always argued that infiltration is a good route. But the problem is when you go in, you have to understand that one of the things they'll come after is to try to subvert your integrity and character and to corrupt you. I mean, that's one of the basic things you have to be aware of and cognizant of so that you can basically not lose, the values that you have as a human. I mean, that's one of the things that struck me that they attempted to do when I was there. I mean, as you go up in the ranks in organizations like that, the corruption creeps in from it becomes more of a political agenda as you get in higher ranking in the organization, and you get away from the mission focus and the mission objectives. And the part is that I call it the cloning process. There's a cloning process. You have to be conditioned to think the way they think. So in other words, this is that shadow secret government that everybody's talking about. It's the existing bureaucrats that don't move when the politicians are elected and they change and the political appointees change, but the bureaucrats stay. That's the fundamental stable government behind, if you want to call it stable. They have they have a fixed agenda and it hasn't changed.
When you first started doing your job, I mean, you were doing your job the whole time, but when you were talking to the proper authorities about what was going wrong with the NSA and intelligence, did they try to discredit you? Because clearly now, 17 years later, you are still known as someone who has his, who's credited. You're not discredited. At least I haven't seen anything or read anything that tries to defame you or say, don't believe this guy, he didn't exist. Did they ever try to do anything like that, to try to deny the fact that you were an NSA employee, anything like that?
No, that was kind of hard. See, even Congress knew what I had done at NSA because they were quite aware of all the developments I had left them. In fact, they were also aware that all this, basically the software that was being used currently to spy on the world, most of that was developed in the lab that I had put together with Dr. John Taggart. So I mean, there was no question of that, and they were well aware of my position and what I had done there. So nobody tried to deny any of that.
When in September 2002, when you asked the DoD IG to investigate the NSA for wasting millions and millions of dollars, when you said we complained, who along with you went to them?
There were 4 of us who signed the DoD IG complaint. 3 of us from NSA, Ed Loomis, Kirk Wiebe, and myself. And then Diane Rourke from the intelligence, she was on the staff of the House Intelligence Committee. She was the senior staffer for the Republicans there and handling the NSA account. So she knew all the aspects of NSA's account. So we went together to do that reporting to the DoD IG's office. There were two paths we attempted to do. The path for the DoD IG report, for that report, they solicit, reporting of fraud, waste, abuse, and corruption. That's the DOD's thrust. The DoD IG's thrust is looking at that component. For the constitutional violations, we attempted to see Chief Justice Rehnquist of the Supreme Court because that was really his agenda. But we couldn't get through to him, and we actually tried. Those of us who had gotten out of NSA and were working in the contracting or consulting area at the time knew a contractor who had gone to high school with the Chief Justice's daughter. So we sent a note through him to his daughter to send to the Chief Justice to try to get a meeting so that we could notify him of all this violations of the Constitution being done by NSA. But it wasn't just NSA, it was being used by the FBI all along also. They had direct access to all that data from the beginning. Even Mueller, he basically said that in his interview with Bart Gellman in March or April of 2011 when he was getting ready to go out leave as head of the FBI. But he had said they'd been using the Stellar Wind program since 2001. Well, the Stellar Wind program is the domestic spying program. That's where they collect all the data on U.S. citizens. They put it in this partitioned area, and it's classified Stellar Wind, and you have to have that compartment clearance to get in to see that data. So, but that's what the FBI's been doing all along, and there is no oversight of them doing that. And you don't hear anything from the FISA court or the intelligence committees or anybody about oversight of what the FBI is doing with the NSA collected data.
You mentioned the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, SCOTUS, as some people might know it, or people who went to law school like me would definitely know SCOTUS. Do you think that other members of the Supreme Court are at least have knowledge of what's going on in the FISA courts, or is it just the Chief Justice who appoints the judges and it sort of stays between them?
No, they're well aware of what the FISA court does. It's not the Chief Justice is the one who makes all the appointments, as far as I know. I don't think others get in, although they may recommend people. The federal judges in different courts, they may recommend for them to be also assigned to the FISA court. But I call the FISA court an Article 2 court. Most of the courts are Article 3, where you have judges who hear an argument, both sides of the argument in open court, and then they decide based on the Constitution and the laws what the adjudication should be. But in the FISA court, they meet only in the Department of Justice. They hear only the government side, and they don't hear anybody else. So therefore, it's an Article 2 court. It's an administration court. It's not a Article 3 court.
And hence that way it's not subject to appeals, and just like you said, it wouldn't fall under the Article 3 court, or it would have both sides. And earlier, as I mentioned, the defense doesn't know. And again, this goes back to what we were saying earlier about the Constitution. To spy on United States citizens, what probable cause? I guess that's what FISA was created for. The act was made for, was to circumvent the entire Constitution, so you can go around these people. But it seems to me, at least from what I've been paying attention to from other people that I've spoken to, that a majority of the people that are being spied upon or surveilled are United States domestic citizens who are not committing any crime, as opposed to people that, or maybe nations or intelligence agencies that should be looked at. And I also think because of the mainstream media, certain countries have a bad reputation when really they're not our true spoken enemy. Do you get that sort of feel too?
Yeah, and in fact, I would also add that the FBI and the DEA and the IRS as well are looking into all this data and using it for common crime inside the United States. And then they pull what's called a parallel construction. They manufacture data to submit in the courtroom instead of the NSA data, so that they could. The NSA data was collected without a warrant, and so they can't really use that in the court. So they manufacture data to convict people for common crime inside the United States. That's been going on since 2001. And in fact, when the Reuters did their article about it in August of 2013, shortly after the material came out from Edward Snowden, the Reuters interviewer of one of the federal agents involved in the program said, "This is such a great program. I just hope we can keep it secret." Well, that's perjury in federal court and in state and local courts to convict people of common crime. That's perjury. And that's what our government's been doing. And so they've put together a policy, what I called was a planned program policy committing perjury and subverting our entire judicial process.
Essentially deny, and if people are doing it in the names of national security, it's okay, and therefore they believe it's not a crime. Is that what you think the going on in their minds is?
Well, that's what they claim, yeah, but that's not it at all. I mean, it's not for national security. I mean, collecting all the data on U.S. citizens, of what value is that when it comes to national security? When in fact you can focus in on people, terrorists or other kinds of criminals calling into the United States, and focus on those people in the United States and not everybody else. You don't have to look at everybody else. All you have to do is look at the ones who are involved. And when you do that, you get a focused, disciplined approach to solving the problem. That's what we did with Thin Thread. We pulled out those needles only and let everything else go by, so that everything our analysts looked at was always relevant or highly likely to be relevant.
What changes did you notice after 9/11, aside from the budgets going up?
Well, just the idea the laws didn't matter anymore. I mean, so and the Constitution was thrown out the window. I mean, they kept saying we're in special cases and we're at war. Well, nobody declared war. At least the only body that can declare war, according to our Constitution, is Congress, and they did not declare war. So then when you and other people argued the War Powers Act under the Article 2 of the Constitution, that's not relevant because Congress did not declare war. So they had a false argument to begin with, and they expanded that false argument to allow them to look at everybody's communications and everything they were doing electronically in the United States and around the world. So, but when it came to U.S. citizens, they were compiling digitally. They had stored a dossier, basically an outline of your electronic life, financial transactions, phone calls, emails, and so on. Surfing the web and all that stuff, and chatting and everything else. All of that, short messages included, all of that about you and who your community was throughout your entire life. As the data was being collected, it kept being stored. So they had this large storage of data and information on you that they could retroactively analyze for anything they wanted over any period of time that was stored. So, it's just a straight violation of the First, Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments, the Constitution, as well as any number of laws, the Penn-Reddish Law, Electronic Privacy Act, Electronic Security Act, all of those things, and many more laws, too.
Right now, openly, we know about drones not just used in the Middle East, but around the world for surveillance. As a matter of fact, local police departments are finally getting budgets for drones, which should be a worry to a lot of people. And some people are like, oh, I'm not growing fields of poppies or fields of marijuana, so what do I have to worry about? But again, this goes onto the spying of our very own people. This goes against our privacy. Now, since drones are very much out in the open now, and I would assume that for a long period of time this was a secret technology or technology that they didn't want the public to know. When did you first start noticing that we started using drones against anybody, and then they started using the drones against us? Or were they always used concurrently against, and I guess you could, I don't want to say the word enemy because it just could be somebody foreign, but anybody foreign or domestic?
Well, I mean, they had airborne platforms all along, of different forms. RC-135 things. One of them was shot down by the North Koreans when, as I recall, it was President Nixon came into office. But the point was that having airborne platforms collecting information has been pretty standard all along, like with the U-2s and the SR-71s and things of that nature, and it simply moved to unmanned vehicles. But also they're using things like balloons. If you remember, there was a tethered balloon just right outside of Baltimore that got free and went dragging all the way up into Pennsylvania before it came down when the tether broke. But that balloon basically was a collection device that would collect cell phones contacts all the way up and down the Atlantic coast from like New York to probably somewhere around Newark, not Newark, but also down to Norfolk, Virginia. So somewhere in that range, it would be looking at all the cell phones going up and down the East Coast. And the same was true of that similar balloon was in Kabul, in Afghanistan. They had one of those there, and it broke the tether too. So it's kind of a dangerous thing to keep a balloon up there with a tether coming all the way to the ground,
Yeah.
especially airplanes flying around. So
Now that you're in Europe, have you noticed any difference with the way the government treats you there as opposed to the way the government here treats us here? And I'll give you one example. I was dating a girl who went to go study abroad in England, so we went together to Amsterdam. We wanted to rent one of those boats in the canals, those pedal boats. And
yeah.
so we rented the boat. We paid the guy. He said, "Okay, be back in an hour." And we're sitting there, riding the pedal boat, and we're looking around. There's other boats going around us. And I said, if this was the United States, they'd say, sign this contract. Here's a life vest. Here's a helmet. And you have to stay with us in this 50-foot by 50-foot barrier or whatever the little yard they created. Have you noticed more freedoms where you are now as opposed to what's going on here in the United States?
I think there's more emphasis over here also on privacy. Yeah, in terms of the digital data, who owns the data is, and over here under EU law, the person whose data it is owns the data, and if any of the third parties, any of the service providers want to share it or sell it or whatever, their data to somebody else, they have to get their permission to do it. And in fact, that's one of they also don't consider the United States a free harbor anymore, putting your data over there and thinking it'll be safe because it's shared with the U.S. government, and and the U.S. government can't protect its own data. Witness the OPM hack and all the data they lost there on all the people who had clearances in the United States government, all that stuff. So they can't even keep it safe once they get it from hackers or the Chinese or the Russians or anybody else, or even the Israelis or the British. Everybody can hack in. So it's just a real mess over there. Over in the U.S., it's really a mess in terms of and in the U.K. and in terms of spying and bulk spying on everybody with every vehicle they ever use. So over here, they're emphasizing more. In the EU part of Europe, it's a question of freedoms and individual rights are more important to them. At least it appears that way legally, because the GDPR, that's their law coming out for the EU governing data and data protection and who owns the data and all that, and what companies or governments are allowed to do. And for example, the Austrian government earlier this year, late last year, early this year, ruled the bulk collection of data unconstitutional, and also their parliament banned bulk collection. Everybody except the conservatives in their parliament voted it down, and so it's gone. And Austria is the first government in the world to move in that direction, the right direction, in my view. So, but over here you can see that they're more concerned with privacy.
One thing about the UK that always concerned me is the CCTVs, and I was just wondering, is that ever going to cross over to the US? But at the same time, if they're using every smartphone or every available device to watch you on camera and listen to you, in some way they sort of have the CCTV. But the difference is in the UK, you can't go anywhere without seeing those cameras. Do you feel that way, that that's going to start happening in the United States? I mean, more blatantly?
Yeah, and for example, what they where I see this going in the future is they have you carry around your cell phone that gives you a GPS on where you are, so they know where you are within a foot or two or three, and so they can look at cameras and see if they've got a picture of that particular area at a certain time that you're there, and then it can compile several times when that occurs over time. And then it can then match you and your face with your GPS and get this, therefore, is your picture. It's more data about you and where you are. So they know where you are then and what you're doing, and then copying, collecting all the things you're saying on the phone or an email or so on. It gives them an idea of what you're thinking, and so they're looking at your thinking, where you are, and who you're with when you're doing it. So, plus matching your visual face up and with the facial recognition kind of software.
So the technology is actually, like I said, it was the double-edged sword. Yes, some people can actually say, okay, it's improved us. For instance, you can have a face-to-face conversation via computer using Skype, but at the same time, we're giving all that up and for the defense or so-called defense or intelligence of the United States and the nations that it works with. One thing I wanted to ask you, you would definitely would know about this and would be a good authority to talk about, is the 5 Eyes. Can you explain what the 5 Eyes is to everyone?
Yeah, that's basically the set of 5 countries, the English-speaking countries, the UK, Canada, US, Australia, and New Zealand. That was the close cooperation back in World War II, working on the codes and ciphers of the Japanese and the Germans, and the Russians and various other people. So, but that's where it started. That close cooperation started back there, where we exchanged people in Bletchley Park, and British sent some people over here, both to work on the Manhattan Project as well as NSA, the predecessor to NSA, and CIA, and that's where that close cooperation in this effort worldwide started. And so that's the origin of the 5 Eyes intelligence group. Which basically a lot of other countries want to join because it's like the premier intelligence group in the world. And it started, they said, basically with the Enigma work against the Germans and other low-level ciphers they had, and also the purple codes and the JN25, the naval codes for the Japanese back in World War II. Those were the main efforts in Europe and Asia. And
we are coming close to the end of the interview, and I definitely would like to have you back because you're definitely full of knowledge, and I've been watching and paying attention to your work for quite some time. I'm going to ask you real quick right now, please stay on after I give my final argument, or my final statements to everybody. But if you have a final statement for all the listeners out there, what would it be?
Just to get, I keep saying that people have more power than they realize. They may think they're helpless to even make a statement or do anything to combat this particular bulk acquisition of data against them and everybody else in our country, but they're not. They've got more power than they think. They should simply stand up and say, look, either you people change this or we're going to work to fire you, and say we're going to support anybody who will work against you to solve this problem for us, and if you don't do it, we're going to make it perfectly clear that we are against you. So and make that statement in public forums, like when representatives or senators come out for their town meetings and so on. Make that clear to them that that's what you're going to do.
And we do have politicians on this show, and that's one thing that I'm going to actually try to bring up more to them, because it seems to me they don't want to talk about intelligence. Mr. Binney, Bill Binney, I want to thank you very, very much. I also want to give thanks to the people at Late Night in the Midlands, Daryl and Katie Neely, the managers who are also the software engineers or the audio engineers for the show, the owner, Michael Vara, and in the United Kingdom, Deprogrammed Radio Network, run by, of course, JC. We want to thank him. Also want to thank Pam Vrettenberg. She runs the social media aspect of this show, and her website is unitedtruthseekers.com, as well as I do want to thank Adorai K Studios, who's also my #1 moderator, whose also name is Adam Reen. And I do want to say, people, remember, the only thing you need to remember about the name of the show, or about this show, is the name of the show, Dr. J Radio Live. That is DRJ Radio Live, Live. Everything from the website, drjradiolive.com, minds.com, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Flickr, Tumblr, YouTube, Google, Pinterest, whatever you could think of, there is an account, even Patreon. So with that being said, everyone, I want to thank you all for joining us, and I want you in the morning in the United Kingdom or the EU to have a good morning, and those of you in the East Coast of the US to have a good evening. And for those around the world, wherever you are, I hope you are having a great day. With that being said, this is Dr. J, and I am officially signing off. Okay.